I think we'll move to the next presentation by Aaron Wolf. Aaron is professor of geography at Oregon State University. He's in a department of geosciences, that is nested in studies of planet Earth. And he is the director of a program about water conflict management and transformation, but maybe equally important, and is called upon by many in our country and around the world for his insights about these issues. And it seems to me fitting that we've gone from a fairly framing kind of setting set by Vandana to how that fits into the world's food and, in a sense, water world. And now we're going to hear more about the water world and how that fits into this construct. Aaron, it's all yours. Welcome, Aaron Wolf.
Thank you. All Holiness, Eminences. That feels so cool to say that, I have to say. It's a joy to be here, and I have to say, I'm a water guy. I'm a scientist. I'll talk about that in a second. But the water world has watched this series of events, and I have to say that you, sir, and those involved in this have changed the tenor of discussion because of this series on the rivers of the world. And for that, we thank you. So I'm a scientist, and I want to start with that, with my credentials as a scientist. I'm in the Department of Geosciences. I'm the chair of the Department of Geosciences. I'm in the College of Science, and I say that because what it means is I have no credentials at all to talk about what I'm actually going to talk about, which is a map of God's consciousness. I start with water, what we use it for. And we use it for everything that we do. And the beauty of this series is that it reminds us how integrally we're dependent in a relationship with the water resources around us. What it means for us humans, though, is that water management, for all its uses, is conflict management. We use water. I asked a grad student to come up with pictures for each of the uses of water. That's obviously the environment. This is transportation. I like that. Hydropower, of course, agriculture, spiritual purposes, and of course, drinking water. To manage even between these different uses requires conflict management. And this is more important now because, as we've been hearing for the last several days, the climate crisis, we experience the climate crisis through the hydrologic cycle. Almost entirely through the hydrologic cycle. So how we manage water, both historically and today, is only going to be tested more so in the future. The realm that I generally work in, I work at all scales of this issue of shared water resources. But the one scale where, somewhere there's a, no, I got it. The one area where I do the most work is what happens when we take this watershed where everything's connected to everything else. Figure on the left, the only boundaries are a watershed, and these are the things that unite us. Quality, quantity, surface water, groundwater, all that we do within this unit has to be managed as a whole in order to do it efficiently. Well, what we do politically is absolutely ignore those boundaries as we draw our political boundaries, which means that to manage water effectively, we need to communicate with our neighbors. We need to communicate with other states, with other jurisdictions, with other sectors, and quite often with other nations. This figure's been brought up before. There's 263 international basins in the world, and you look how much of the world is shared water resources. All of the rivers that this series has gone through, the last 8 series, have all been international basins. It's about half the land surface of the earth, 40% of the world's population, but more importantly, 90% of the world's countries share water, 80% of the world's fresh water originates within shared basins. So the way that we share is absolutely critical. And when I got into this world 20 years ago, People were talking about that right-hand side of the spectrum. They were talking about the potential for conflict and war. A number of people have brought that up here, and they would use 6 case studies over and over: the Indus, the Jordan, the Ganges, Tigris, Euphrates, over and over, showing us that armies have been mobilized and shots have been fired over shared water. And I came to this series of questions, trained as a scientist, and asking scientifically, what do we know? If there's 263, and if people are talking about 6, what about the rest? Is it possible that there's a record of things besides conflict? Is it possible there's a record of maybe nothing happening, or maybe a record of intense cooperation? So putting again the scientific method to this question, one of the things that we tried to do rigorously was go beyond the 6. What's happening in the rest of the world? We went through 50 years of records of conflict chronologies and of news databases and anywhere we could find documentation of 2 countries doing anything to each other over shared water, and scaled it, coded it along that scale from intense conflict to intense cooperation. And just doing that gives us a very interesting picture of what the world actually does. This now is the spectrum from very intense cooperation to war. And what we notice right away is that 2/3 of the time that we do anything with each other over shared water, we cooperate. 2/3 of the time. And these aren't people that like each other. These are Arabs and Israelis, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians are cooperating over shared water resources. And this happens at all scales. In my part of the world, farmers and environmentalists and urban dwellers are sitting together and talking about their shared water resources. And because water's tied to everything we do, when they talk about their shared water, they're talking about their shared vision of the future. It's a great excuse to get people in the room and a language to talk about the future. Now, there is a record of international violence. 80% of conflict is verbal conflict. This means 80% of the time it's a politician saying, we will go to war to protect the lifeblood of the nation. Now, it never happens in the United States, but in some other parts of the world, politicians lie.
Oh, excuse me.
Sometimes when a politician says we will go to war, the first question you would ask is, who's he talking to? Generally, he's not talking to the neighbor at all. He's talking to his own constituents. And when he says we will go to war, he's basically saying, vote for me in November. This is hugely important because when we look at the actual record of violence over shared water resources across international boundaries, in the last 50 years there have been 37 instances. None of these escalated into war. 27 of these are between Israelis and Arabs, and the last shot fired on the Jordan between Israelis and Arabs over water was in 1970. So in the worst possible case, where demand hit supply in 1968, where populations are growing, where economic growth is happening, where all of the things have changed in the last 30 years, the water issues have been settled in the absence of violence. And if we look for a war, at -7, there have been none, specifically over water, specifically across international boundaries. Not in the last 50 years, not in the last 1,000 years. You have to go back 4,500 years to find the only documented case between the city-states of Lagash and Umma that fought a war over water, which in turn resulted in the first water treaty, of which there have now been 3,700. So 0 wars, 3,700 treaties. That's interesting. And it begs the question, how can we encourage this kind of dialogue? How can we use the crises that challenge us and face our water resources to encourage precisely the kind of dialogue that needs to happen? Moreover, once we create institutions to share our water resources, the institutions tend to be very resilient over time. The picnic table talks between Israel and Jordan happened in the 1950s, and since that time, through 2 wars, through 2 intifadas, the Israelis and Arabs have been able to manage their water resources cooperatively. The Mekong Committee, established 1957, survives the Vietnam War, the bombing of Cambodia. People continue to exchange water resource data. The Indus, established in 1960 between India and Pakistan, not only survives 2 wars between the two, but in the middle of one of the wars, India makes payments to Pakistan as part of their treaty obligations. Currently, when we go around the world, as I do, places where there's tension and people won't talk about anything else, often they'll talk about water resources. Other things that we do, again, kind of big macro scientific things, we try and look at the climate change models and notice where there's lack of institutional capacity, because the capacity for the institution to adapt to change becomes a critical component in conflict and conflict mitigation. None of this is what I wanted to talk about today. Half of my time is spent doing this kind of big macro statistical stuff, often using a lot of computer power. Half of what I do is in the room, is conflict facilitation, mediation, and this is really where I wanted to talk, because I think it goes more specifically to the questions that we've been charged to answer here. There's a process, a kind of stage, an idealized model of conflict that Jay Rothman has used. It's not ideal, but it works a little bit, and those of us who've been involved in conflict facilitation recognize this. People walk in the room angry, they're adversarial, they want to yell and vent, and at some point, something will happen, there's a transformation in the room, and people start to reflect, they start to listen. The reflexive stage, and then maybe with some help, sometimes with some guidance, they'll integrate their thinking and look for the integrative solutions, and finally maybe go out into the room and bring to bear the action, the fruits of their labors. In the water world, this generally starts people talking about their rights. I deserve the water because I'm upstream. I deserve the water because I've been using it longer. And at some point, we recognize that rights-based discussion can't go anywhere. And so at some point we flip the question and ask, okay, maybe you deserve the water, what do you actually need? What do you need for your irrigation, for your hydropower, for your transportation? And that transformation from rights to needs, maybe we talk about interests. Why do you need the water? Is it to make a living, or is it your way of life? That leads to 2 very different solution sets. Finally, perhaps we'll talk about the equitable distribution of the benefits that water brings, which gets us away from trying to allocate water. So these 4 kind of stages, those, again, I know a number of us have been involved in these issues. We recognize the transformation necessary to get us from step to step. If you think in terms of pictures, that first stage is the current situation with boundaries and watershed boundaries together. To think a little bit differently, we take the boundaries off the map and think about the things that unite us within the basin. We then can think about the benefits that water brings, and maybe how we might enhance the benefits by cooperation. And then finally, we bring the boundaries back down onto the basin in order to think about how to distribute the benefits so that there's equity in our agreement. So these are the 4 stages, and again, each one requires a transformation in thinking. And the model that I'd been taught as a mediator is a very rational model of transformation. People will say people agree when it's in their interest to agree. If you put the right resources on the table, people will agree. Well, that's nice, but then you ask, because I'm a scientist, how do you know when it's in people's interest to agree? Well, because they agreed. That's what we call in the scientific world a tautology. That's absolute circular logic, and again, those of us who've been involved in conflict settings recognize that it has little or nothing to do with actual conflict or conflict transformation. Not if there's any real emotion or real pain or real a wound present. In that case, we have to look beyond the rational. And so my question at the time, I'm, again, a scientist, have I mentioned that? So I'm thinking, where are our models for transformation, if not rationality? If not rationality, who knows something about transformation? Well, doctors do. Doctors see all the time. People have a heart attack. Suddenly their lives are different. I'm going to spend more time with the kids. I'm going to work less. I'm going to focus on the things I love. Mothers do. Parents do. Your children are born. One minute you're the center of the universe. The next you're a feeding mechanism. Right? We recognize transformation in life, but I was looking for something a little more systematic. Where are the structures, the models? And it was playing with this pair of images with a friend of mine at the World Bank who also is a deeply spiritual person, and thinking about this concept of taking the boundaries off the map and thinking about transformation. How do you take the boundaries off the map? And he looked at this and he said, you know, that looks a little bit like a metaphor for spiritual transformation. He said, isn't that what spiritual traditions do, is help us get from thinking about the things that divide us, our immediate requirements, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, and thinking about the possibilities without boundaries, our relationship to each other, or the relationship to the divine. Well, that's kind of interesting, and I try and be a good scientist, so I go where the inquiry leads, and this was a fascinating place to start to think. Is it possible, I asked this rhetorically in this room, but is it possible from my scientific perspective in a state land-grant school to think, can we learn something about conflict management, resource management, by explicitly asking the spiritual traditions what constructs they have that can help us do management better? Very explicit set of questions. And so this led to, first, a meeting in Vatican City, of all places. It was co-sponsored Oregon State University, the Vatican Science Council. I'm sorry, I didn't know the Vatican had a science council. And my friend Peter Glick at the Pacific Institute. Mary Evelyn was there. Father John was there representing your all Holiness. It was a wonderful and absolutely fruitless meeting. We brought together spiritual leaders and people who were involved in water resource negotiations, and it was a short meeting. It was 3 days, and we found that we just didn't have a common language. We did not have a common language to think about the things that we had to think about. Nevertheless, it sparked, I think, some really interesting thinking about explicitly learning the constructs of conflict and anger from the spiritual traditions to understand transformation better so that we can do it in the water world, in the environmental world. And so we did. We asked two sets of questions, one about the constructs of conflict and anger, and the others about process techniques. How do we create settings that are conducive to the transformation that we've already experienced is necessary to have happen? So I'll give you a couple of examples, and you'll bear with me, I hope. Here's a list of the four stages of conflict, the four stages in a water conflict, the maps with the boundaries, without the boundaries. And here's another column that comes, that seems to have parallels in this process, the physical, emotional, intuitive, and spiritual. Anybody recognize that last column? Sorry, I didn't mean to jar you out of your, just hit play, right? Anybody recognize that? Sorry? You guys are like my classes. I hear you. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Anybody recognize that? It will be on the test. It will be on the test. Some people see Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It actually, I recognize it from my tradition. These are the four levels of holiness that Moses went as he climbed Mount Sinai. The temple in Jerusalem was structured as a guide through these four levels of holiness from the outer courtyard to the Holy of Holies. It's a guided process. Interestingly, Angkor Wat in Cambodia has a similar structure that instead of going inward, goes inward and upward through these 4 levels. When the temple was destroyed, this was adapted by the rabbis into the Jewish prayer service, which is now a guided meditation through these 4 levels. But as it came out of this meeting and with investigation, it turns out that this is a fairly universal construct in all faith traditions that I've ever come across, that the idea of seeing the world through 4 distinct lenses that can best be accessed in sequence turns out to be in Judaism, in Christianity, the idea in exegesis that there are 4 meanings to every word in the Bible, from a very basic understanding to a spiritual, almost secretive understanding. In Buddhism, 4 jhanas, states of meditation that start with physical bliss and move all the way into an interconnectedness. A couple of people have suggested that our brains are actually hardwired to move through this sequence from a reptilian physical experience, the limbic brain, the cortex, and our unused potential, 85%. So you ask yourself, that's interesting. If it is a universal construct, or seems to be, can we use it in negotiations? Can we move, when we're talking about water, from physical water, which people desperately need for drinking, all the way up to spiritual water, the spiritual purity that all of our traditions require of us in our faith traditions. So if we structure, just give you an example, Israelis and Arabs are negotiating, and the Palestinian Jordanian side was insistent on talking about rights, and the Israelis rights. The Israelis were talking about allocations. The idea was the Palestinians and the Jordanians would only talk about the past. They were talking about either physical water, because there simply isn't enough for Palestinians to drink, not a safe, stable supply, or emotional water, water representing the occupation, water representing the fact that the Israelis had their hands on their taps. And the Israelis were talking about allocations, talking about the future. Nobody dies from bad water in Israel, and so they're talking about intellectual exercises. Can you move water from agriculture to industry? Can you desalinate water? This very intellectual exercise, but if we notice there was a disconnect between past and future, that they didn't realize that when they said water, they were talking about 3 very different things. Until in the negotiations somebody noticed and suggested the term rightful allocations to deal with all 3 together, and this helped break a logjam. And currently in the Southwest, of course, Native peoples, when they talk about water, generally they talk about spiritual water. It's connected to the Hopi spiritual cycle is the hydrologic cycle. And you ask the Hopi, can we use the water from your sacred spring, spiritual water, in order to move coal slurry from place to place, intellectual water, you realize what a profound disconnect there is. So recognizing the different levels of meaning and how we might approach them in sequence turns out to be tremendously powerful. You have borne with me so far. Let's go deeper. I'm a geographer. I'll map anything. I love maps. This is a map. This is a Kabbalistic map of the universe. And the way it works, I'll give you Kabbalah. This is something people spend decades studying, and I'll give you the 30-second version. The universe is crafted into 10 spheres, 10 holy spheres of the divine. And because the universe is God, this is also a map of God's consciousness. And the way it works is that grace flows from the world above down to us in the world below. And the more we align our will with God's will, the more that conduit is open and the more grace flows into the world. And because we're created in God's image, this is also a map of our own consciousness. Okay, that's Kabbalah in a nutshell. I want to focus on 3 Sfirot right there in the middle to talk about other possible lessons for how we might approach the questions of the day. All of the questions we've been asked have been posed as either or. Is it science or spirituality? Is it economy or ecosystem? And what this structure tells us is yes. The question has to be posed as and. How do we do economies and healthy ecosystems? How do we deal with rationality and spirituality? So how does this work? The way these three sfirot are balanced is in a divine balance. On the one side, we have the sphere of chesed. This is loving kindness. This is the openness, the unbounded love that we talk about. The din is the justice, the closed. And you can see these as representing the times that we need boundaries around us, the rational world, the need for punishment sometimes, the things that we can measure on the left, and the openness, the unboundedness that we often need on the right. Any parent, again, gets this intuitively. If you raise your kid just with din, what happens? They end up on a campanile somewhere taking pot shots at co-eds, right? You don't raise your kid just with justice, and likewise, you don't give your child all the love that they need, all the support that they need all the time. It's a balance between the two, and the balance in this construct is that chesed, the loving kindness, is just a bit higher. To remind us that if there's ever a conflict between the two, a contradiction between the two, it's chesed that takes precedent. It's loving kindness that takes precedence. And the two are in this balance of rachamim. What's rachamim? It's translated as compassion, but Dr. Barker will help us remember, rachamim comes from the same root as rechem, which is the womb. The womb, and what this tells us about this relationship is the same relationship a mother has to her unborn child, that she gives all of the love, her life force, to her child only as long as she's healthy herself. So this idea of dealing with things in balance, yes, it's rationality and spirituality. Yes, it's science and spirit or religion. These are critical, and to come to the wonderful question that was posed here at the break, I don't think that it's religion or monotheism that's the problem. We in the West split these in two at the Enlightenment. We decided that we were going to live in a rational world, in a world that we can measure, and we were going to take spiritual stuff and delegate it to your private life, to your Friday, your Saturday, your Sunday communities. And as long as we're stuck here, we end up where we end up. If you only do things that you can measure, you talk about gross domestic product without talking about happiness, culture, spirit, all of the things that could balance these kinds of issues in this balance. It's not the only model in the world in conflict resolution. A lot of the Arab world, the Muslim world, balances our Western idea of justice with the concept of mercy. They have a sulha, a ceremony of forgiveness. When somebody has done something wrong, they come to the community and they say, I've done something wrong, will you forgive me? Which gives the power back to the person who's had the power taken away from them, and the rift in the fabric of the community can be healed by the person who's been wronged. That brings the perpetrator back into the community and allows the community, it balances rights and honor. The word in Arabic, a wonderful concept we don't have in the West, tarah din, resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation. What a great concept. What a wonderful concept. How do we throw people in prison for years and years without ever thinking about where they're going to end up and how we're going to reintegrate them into the community? The question I asked here, was this for me? I hope not. Okay. I'm going to ignore the 2-minute warning, assuming it's not mine.
It's okay.
The other wonderful thing about this model and why it's useful to a mediator is because in this construct, the source of anger and even of evil is too much self, too much justice. What does that mean? It means that when somebody is angry, they're masking, they're shielding a vulnerability within themselves. And when somebody comes at you with anger, the natural inclination to respond with anger gets you nowhere in a dialogue. But if you recognize that their anger comes from too much boundaries, too much of a wall around their vulnerabilities, maybe they're in danger of losing their job or their health or their livelihoods or their spiritual lives, that's the source of the anger, then we can learn how to better absorb or deflect the anger, how to listen better in order to allow the anger to wash over you to get to the vulnerability where you can have a conversation. This leads to the practice of deep transformative listening that we learn from the great spiritual traditions. When you talk to a monk or people with deep practice, you feel that they're listening to you with all their being. You're the center of the universe for a minute. Our model is different. There's a joke that people tell about Americans. In America, what's the opposite of speaking? Waiting to speak. Right? How often do we just stop and with our whole being say, I know I disagree with this person, I know that, but I just have to listen for a minute to understand where they're coming from, because as they continue, they'll get deeper and deeper and deeper through these 4 levels until the vulnerability comes out, until the intuition comes out, until finally, possibly, often, you can find a place for at least an intellectual connection and often a spiritual connection. That's powerful stuff. This is not something that I learned in Mediation 101. The deep listening traditions come from all of our spiritual traditions. All around the world, people have listening as a spiritual practice. I took a 13-week course in listening. This was all on the phone. Yeah, I'm still listening. Yes. There's practice to it. There's deep practice to it, especially when your own values are challenged, especially when things, your own triggers are triggered. The question I asked also about this, after our meeting in Vatican City, a couple of wonderful things happened. One, I got tenure, which meant I couldn't be fired for following this train of thought. And 2, I had a sabbatical, which allowed me to spend 14 months in different parts of the world studying with masters of spiritual traditions to understand these constructs. And I was always interested in what feels universal versus what feels whatever the opposite of universal is. And this I asked of a Buddhist monk in the forest of Thailand who was doing amazing mediation based on Buddhist tradition, mostly on land use issues. But because of his presence, he was also tapped into to facilitate between Muslims and Buddhists in southern Thailand. And I presented this whole construct to him. Of course, many Christians will see this construct in the Trinity, right? For some, this resonates as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit wrapped up in a Trinity. And I asked him if this was a Buddhist construct also, because I had understood Buddhism as chesed, all about loving kindness, openness. And he said, well, it's interesting. Have you ever seen this symbol? The perpetual balance. This isn't Buddhist necessarily, but this is what he used as his reference for this idea of balance between self and other, or self and community, between justice and mercy, and between science and rationality. Why is this so critically important? One, I think it helps us do our jobs better. In the West, we have trained mediators badly. It is not a rational process, and all of us know that. Anybody who's in a relationship, anybody who's has a child, anybody who's been involved where there's real pain knows that rationality is only one place to find the answers. But 2, we take this post-Enlightenment concept of what's measurable and rational out into the world with us. And this is, for example, all of the international aid that goes out from the West to the rest of the world on water resource projects. And every time we show up, we tell these communities, come back to us. You can have the money if you measure X, Y, and Z. These are your milestones that you must reach, and they're all immeasurable quantities. And what that means, besides the intellectual imperialism of the concept of saying what's measurable is the only thing that's important, is that we end up destroying communities in the way that many people here have talked about doing. I sat in a room on the Nile where somebody was talking about the idea of equitable distribution of benefits. And a wonderful woman from Uganda raised her hand and she said, just so I understand correctly, you're telling us that this wasn't an international river until you guys came and drew these straight lines and made it an international river. And now because it's an international river, we have to figure out how to cooperate with people we've been cooperating with forever. And the way to do it is to work through your concept of benefits, which are only the things you measure, and you're going to strip away all of the things that are important to us, our community values, our spiritual values, and that's what you're going to define as success? This conversation is happening all over the world. When we look at where our foreign aid is going and the impact it's happening, we have to recognize the cultural imperialism that comes with it. I won't talk about the wonderful process techniques, amazing things, learning how to listen, learning how to sit in as we do in prayer instead of across from each other that's very conflictive, shared narratives by way of sharing our stories. Just amazing process, but because time is limited, I did want to end on this, the hope that our questions, rather than being asked as ors or verses, every time I hear an or a verses, I want to re-ask the question, how can we meet the needs of both? How can we do both? And I want to end with this wonderful quote. The Massachusetts Episcopal Diocese reorganized from political boundaries to watershed boundaries. And their justification was this, simply demonstrating that we're all connected by water, rich and poor, urban and rural, upstream and down, is a fine place to start. I think the Holy Spirit will take care of the rest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That is really powerful stuff for all of our minds to embrace. I think we have time for maybe one question. Yes, if you would go to the mic right away, it would be helpful. Please, begin. I can't see who it is.
Hi, it's Jim Ball. Aaron, terrific presentation. Too much to take in, so we'll have to keep up the dialogue. One of the things that I say about climate change is that, again, to stress kind of there are opportunities with climate change, and I think one of them is that, well, if we don't solve this thing, it really is going to force us to come together a bit, as nation states to come together, and if we don't, we're in real trouble. So that will have benefits in terms of all other kinds of parts of the relationship and help to build relationships. And I heard that a bit in terms of what you were saying about the past history of water. But I'm at the same time, I'm concerned about that maybe history is not going to be the absolute guide here in terms of the impacts of climate change. I have in my draft book an example from Kenya of pastoralists and agriculturalists who had never before, ever, in the elders' memories, had conflicts that led to people being killed. But that's exactly what had happened. And you can probably, there might be a good case to make that climate change had contributed to that situation. If really, the impacts of climate, the vast majority of it is related to water. It's really all about water. And the IPCC projects that upwards of 2 billion people will be in water-scarce situations in this century. And that this is going to happen very fast in Africa. Anywhere upwards of 250 million people. And already water-scarce situations will see a further reduction in their water availability by 2020. So about a decade from now. In other words, it's already starting to happen. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on this. Are you worried that the past is not necessarily going to be predictive of the future given just the vast scale of changes that are going to occur. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I think on the scale, you're right. The past isn't an indication of the future, but I think in terms of human response, the past will be. I talked about the optimistic side of shared waters, and politically across international boundaries, I'm very optimistic. But the case that you point out, there are two very real cases to be pessimistic. One is at the intranational. In other words, nations don't go to war necessarily over water, but tribes do, states do. The Kovri River in India, 2 states right now are fighting within India. I think one of the things that we found is as you drop in scale, the likelihood of violence goes up. So that's one place I'm less than optimistic. But the other is not the political response. It's simply the number of people who are going to be suffering and dying, the number of ecosystems that are going to be destroyed. And that's something, again, that history tells us, that when people live on the margins, people live on the environmental margins, rich people adapt and poor people die. If you look at the difference in response to flooding in the Netherlands versus Bangladesh, you get a very clear sense of what the possibilities are. And I think that is history showing us exactly what the future holds. And as you point out, for greater and greater numbers of people. And there, what I'm hopeful for, again, the lesson of history, is that crises give us the opportunity to do things that are unprecedented. And it may be that this is our call now. To do the kinds of things that we have never done before in terms of cooperating and working together.
Thank you. Is there another person? Please go to the mic. Thank you.
Yeah, Neil Asherson. I'd like to congratulate Dr. Wolf for puncturing a myth which is certainly held by almost everybody, I think, which is that water conflicts inevitably lead to armed conflicts between states, and they don't. And one could often, carry that on. I mean, not very long ago, I was on a river called the Inguri, which separates Georgia and Abkhazia. And that river, has, over the last 15 years, seen so much blood flowing down it. It is still fired over. It is still barricaded. All the crossing points are shut. And yet, right up at the top, at the Inguri River Dam, you see every day Abkhazian, Georgian engineers coming together to look after the water. This is a good example of what you were saying. Maybe one can extend this and to say that examples in which states, and I say states, have gone to war over economic resources are also incredibly rare, contrary to superstition. Innumerable examples where the economic advantages and possibilities in play, but, for example, the invasion of Iraq was not primarily about oil. It justifiable. It would have been more explicable, curious enough, if it had been about oil resources. So in a way, I'm repeating what I wanted to ask you was a question which Jim Ball did, which is, well, looking forward to, as you put it rather well, I thought, we experience climate change almost entirely through the hydrological crisis, and that is right. This crisis is now predicted by some people to produce huge, uncontrollable, massive movements and migrations of population across existing state boundaries in search of simply food and water. Yeah. If it were to come to that, how do you think that your general rule that nation states don't make war over water, do you think it's going to hold in the pretty desperate decades ahead? Yeah,
thank you. First of all, for your comments, which are important to remember. I think my rule will hold. It's not my rule. I don't see nations going to war over water, but I don't want to give the impression of being optimistic. Again, I think the real dangers are exactly what you said: environmental refugees, people suffering, people dying, poverty increasing. Simply the fact that countries don't go to war. Let me just give a statistic. Right now, 2.5 to 5 million people die every year because of a lack of access of safe, stable water supply. 2.5 to 5 million people. That's as big as HIV, AIDS, that's as big as malaria, and it's bigger than anything else. It's bigger than earthquakes and tsunamis and hurricanes and all the wars in any given year put together. That's the crisis. That's the crisis. And our solution needs to be that. It needs to be poverty alleviation. It needs to be wise development. It needs to be helping people adapt to that crisis. The focus on war, frankly, from my perspective, is a red herring. Even if there was a war, what would it do? 1,000 people? 2.5 to 5 million people are dying right now. The war is irrelevant. Now, having said that, I think there's a lot of reason why we won't go to war. It's been pointed out most water is for irrigation. This is a very diverse resource that decision-making is equally diffuse, where the people who make the decisions to go to war aren't vested necessarily in that kind of diffusion. It's hugely heavy. A cubic meter of water weighs a metric ton. You can't go to another country and invade it and take their water anywhere. It doesn't cost out. It just simply, for the same energy, you could desalinate, you could treat your waste, you could do a number of different things. So one, I think there won't be a war, and two, even if there is, let's not be diverted from the crisis at hand.
That's a beautiful way to transition to our next speaker.